present our second case, JD?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. This is REZ 2025-11 for Langdale Capital Assets property, all total approximately 720 acres along Coleman Road. It is currently zoned CC on track 1, which is there to the west, abutting Coleman Road. It has been split by the railroad again, and the eastern portion, track 2, you currently see it zoned R-1, which is low density residential, and the green is conservation zoning. For the future land use map, track 1 is predominantly in the industrial activities center zone, which does recommend for the M-1, which is being requested here. And the track 2, as you notice here, it has a mixture of community activity center character area, suburban area, parks, recs, and conservation for the future land use, which doesn't necessarily recommend M1 at the time. However, staff has reviewed these both tracks and believes that with the conditions proposed, that it might be a viable option here. Before we get into the conditions, I would like to go through and look at the water resource protection map. As you'll note here, there are some isolated wetlands on both tracks. To the south, you have a larger wetland area, and again along the east, the Whitworth River there. You'll notice the floodplains. These are the 2008 FEMA approved floodplain maps. I mentioned 2008 because in the applicant survey, you'll also notice the dashed hatched area. Those are the proposed 2021 FEMA floodplain maps. FEMA has started sending out letters to affected property owners. However, we are unaware of an official adoption date at this time. But they are shown here and they will play a factor in the considerations as we move forward. So again, you see the smooth boundary of the conservation current zoning there. And I'll show it to you a little bit closer here. And you'll see how far outside those current conservation zoning boundaries that the floodplain does extend, but based on the 2021 proposed maps. The R10 portion to the north there along Rustic Ridge, obviously the Foxborough subdivision. You'll notice where Briarberry has dead-ended onto the subject property. And again, one of the upcoming conditions is that there is no access along Briarberry or Quail Hollow, which is a little farther to the east. Now, we talked about possible conservation zoning and the boundaries there. If the updated 2021 maps and conservation zoning were to change on a county-wide level, it is possible that subject property on the east 380-acre tract now has 150 acres more or less of conservation zoning. Again, this is possibility, this is not set in stone, but just showing the effects of updated wetland maps and floodplains and how they might affect this current property. We'll go back to the corner of Foxborough subdivision. You'll note the 200 there in the bottom left-hand corner. Based on the approximate location of those wetlands, again, these have not been fully delineated yet by the applicant or their surveyor, but based on the proposed stream and the information, 200 feet more or less clears the run of the stream. That 200 feet becomes a little more important as we move forward. Again, just an aerial to show what that might look like, because one of the conditions is a 200-foot undisturbed buffer, and that is depicted here. This is for all properties abutting the subject property that are currently zoned residential. Again, mainly meaning Foxborough subdivision to the north of track 2, and then down to the south, again, approximately 13 acres more or less of conservation or undisturbed buffer. And then on track 1, again, this is currently zoned CC, about 13 acres of the 200-foot buffer. All that property to the south is currently zoned R1. You'll also note the wetlands on the property there. Here's an overall picture of those possible buffer zones. Again, 200 feet deep from any abutting residentially zoned property. The minimum zoning buffer for any zoning of a manufacturing nature against residential or conservation, as you know on track 2, is only 40 feet. 40 feet is the minimum buffer required between M1 and residential zoning. Again, based on the scale of this property and the potential for M1 allowed uses, staff is proposing 5 times that amount at 200 feet. Even for an M3 zoning, which would allow something like the paper mill down in Cladeville, it's only 3 times the minimum buffer, so 120. So we've included 200 feet of buffer, just again for the size of this property. We talk about a large campus, a large warehouse type campus. This is the Lowe's distribution center. Each one of those buildings you see there is approximately 1 million square feet, more or less, takes up about 25, 28 acres overall. Again, track 2, there is no current infrastructure on these properties sufficient enough to support industrial development crossing the railroad. However, just for scale and reference, this is what it could possibly look like as a large campus warehouse type building. So with that being said, the TRC analyzed all factors looking at this particular case, including the environmentally sensitive wetlands, the floodplains, and the availability of county utilities along Coleman Road, the potential scale of the proposed development, the review process for a development of regional impact, given its size, and supportive of the following staff recommended conditions. 1, there shall be no access to Briarberry Drive and Quail Hollow Circle from the subject property. 2, should a change in use occur where additional transportation and or water sewer infrastructure upgrades are required, the developer will be responsible for the design, any acquisition of necessary right-of-way, relocation of utilities, and construction costs for the infrastructure improvements. 3, all lots shall front interior roads. 4, a 200-foot undisturbed buffer shall be required along the northern and southern property lines abutting current residential zoning districts boundaries. 5, any lighting located on the property shall be shielded and directed to avoid direct illumination of adjacent properties zoned residentially. 6, any loudspeakers, paging systems, or electromagnetic interference generated on or by uses of the property shall be designed, installed, and used such that they are not discernible at any abutting property lines zoned residentially. 7, and this goes into some of the uses that are allowed in M1, correctional facilities, transitional care facilities, and kennels with outdoor runs shall not be allowed. And that concludes the staff report, sir. Yes, sir.
For clarification, these are conditions.
These are the staff proposed conditions for the rezoning of this property. Yes, sir.
Questions for staff?
JD, I was gonna ask you about M1 zoning, but we don't have the packet, so I'm not complaining about that, I understand. But, you said there were quite a few that are allowed in M1.
Yes, sir. The majority of M1 is aimed at manufacturing, which generally requires buildings larger than 30,000 square feet or more. And thus the condition. Anything 30,000 or less is generally allowed in lighter commercial districts. However, 30,000 is that cutoff for the county, and therefore M1 allows a larger footprint of a building. Again, this was not knowing the final end user at this point, trying to think of a worst case scenario. Staff felt comfortable with these conditions right now, based on all the other M1 uses, with the exception of the 3 listed in condition 7.
And the use table that was in the packet, there was very little difference between what is allowed in commercial highway and what is allowed within M1. The biggest difference was the size of the building, which allows over 30,000 square
That
foot.
tells me a lot, I appreciate that.
Anything further? All right, at this time, we will start the public hearing for this case. Would the applicant or their representative like to speak for this case?
Thank you. My name is Coleman Rd. I'm the applicant for this proposed rezoning. I think you can see by the conditions that we've worked through with the county, it's our intent not to affect any residential neighborhood that abuts this property. And it's our intent to not build anything so high that they could even see it or that they would hear it. We really want to be a good neighbor if we can put anything on this property. So I'm here to answer any questions, and, you know, I think what you see with the recommendations and the conditions that will be in place on this property, it's going to create significant buffer to the residential, any residences that abut this property. And as far as any concern with traffic, there's going to be no traffic coming through Foxborough. You know, we can't access Foxborough, nor would we want to. Our intent is not to harm any of the neighboring properties whatsoever. With anything, noise, smell, I mean anything. We want it to be, because they don't even know we exist back there.
So you're looking at 200 feet of barrier between the Foxborough properties.
That's correct, but in all honesty, it's gonna be more than that, because you can see that the floodplains are gonna come in there. It's gonna, I mean, you can't build on that anyway, so it's probably, JD will probably comment on this, there's probably close to 400. With big tall trees that, you know, you couldn't even see through.
Right.
The only trees that have come down have been because of Hurricane Helene.
Langdale, as you develop the property, I drove by it the other day as much as I could see from Coleman Road. Do you plan to eventually clear cut it, or are you gonna leave some trees, or based on what you plan to do eventually? Or do you anticipate clear cutting the property at some point?
I don't think we would clear cut it. I really don't.
I'm just asking.
Yeah, that's not our intent. I mean, if you drove by there, you'll see that we've been cleaning it up.
Yes.
And that's really just for the time being, to try to, diminish any chance of wildfire risk. You know, with all the trees falling down and everything, we're trying to really do that, not just with this property, but other property as well. It's just taking time.
Nothing like a nebulous question in a situation like this. Do you anticipate down the road, when you fully develop this place, any expansion of Coleman Road would be necessary to widen it or allow better access?
I don't think so.
Well, do you have any idea, or are you looking at anything in particular right now? Or is this all speculative?
Most of it is speculative. I will say there has been some interest for a data center on the east side. And we would consider that. But that's really a long shot on that, in all honesty.
So for the most
Because it's not
part-
something that you can just really go develop on your own. I mean, you have to have a certain amount of power that you can get to a site. That's not up to us. Nor do you have a way to really influence it, if you will.
That's a lot of acreage right there.
It is, and as I told some of the neighbors, I really, it just, in being fair with everybody, it would be really difficult for us to do something on the east track at this time. There's a railroad that bisects this property, and it would be very difficult to traverse that railroad for any real user. And another thing that happens too, so people understand, that's the train stops there. So they actually park that train there. It's what do you call it? It's slipping my mind, but there's two tracks there. And they actually leave the train there overnight, which actually blocks our crossing there. So the people that'll tell you that we lease it to Honey, they hunt in there sometimes and get trapped because the train stops and then the conductor's left and they can't get out. So that's a huge problem for us there. So it's going to be,
Yeah, I can see that.
something's going to have to really change for us to be able to use that east track and all. And I don't see, I mean, we have good plans for an ability to deal with that railroad at this time.
Now, just for, I know you said it, Mr. Pope, but right now you said the development is speculative. You're deciding what you're gonna do with it. Is that what you?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, we don't have a end
Concrete.
user in mind.
Okay.
You know, we're not gonna go just build all those buildings that they put on that map and the hoses.
No, right.
We're not, I can promise you, we're not gonna do that. Rest assured on that.
So really, if you don't, do anything with the east track, you're really not affecting any of the residential properties.
Correct, that's correct. That's correct.
One question I have relates to something that you kind of alluded to as a potential option. I've seen those developments in other areas where they've been a good distance away from residential properties, but they've had impact on the groundwater for residences where they've not been able to, they don't have clean drinking water anymore, especially when they're on well systems and things like that. So are there any thoughts about what you're going to, depending on how you're going to develop this, if it is for that
You're
potential
talking about
use,
this for a data center?
potentially for example?
Well, yeah, we have had those discussions. The new models of these data centers have internally cooled circulated water. So they don't use a lot of water from the a well like they used to. It's a newer design. And I don't know the exact technical terminology for it. If I did, I'll tell you. But a lot of it, like I said, they reuse the same water over and over, interior cooling it.
Well, I've seen where, as of recently as last year, where some people have had issues because of some of the data centers that were built within the last 6 months. So that's why I'm asking.
Right.
Does the county have water there?
They would, I believe so, yes. They have it down Coleman.
Yes, so there's Coleman, Coleman Road has water and sewer.
Anything further?
Yeah.
All right,
Thank
thank you. At this time, would anyone like to speak against the case?
Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Lorraine Seaman. I currently am residing at 4634 Barberry Drive. Hopefully can speak on behalf of a few people here.
Excuse me, ma'am, could you repeat your last name again?
Yeah, Seaman, S-E-E-M-A-N-N.
Thank you.
I don't think this mic's working, but hopefully if I project, you guys can hear me.
Thank you. Pretty good.
Okay. Is this better? Oh, yes. All right. You gotta make sure you can hear me. Okay. So, Mr. Langdale said a few, words like intent a few times, and it really is just that, intent. We feel really threatened by this change and are concerned about noise, habitat loss from an environmental perspective, the aesthetic appearance, and the drop in our home values. There's a lot to unpack with all of that, but I feel like we need some kind of durable protection, right? You know, we can have the best intent possible in not developing some of this land more east of the railroad track, but, you know, things change as time goes on, and we would like to have some better protection. I'll address some of the environmental concerns first. I'm a physician, but I have a degree concentration in environmental science. And when I was in college at Boston State University, I actually did a project in conservation on the area that's in question and documented multiple endangered and threatened species, including the red cockaded woodpecker and the gopher tortoise. And they're very prevalent in that area. That's a serious concern. It's not even related to the selfishness of us not wanting our neighborhood to be disturbed. In addition, you know, the noise of more industrial activity, that's a serious problem. I realize he said that there'll be a 200-foot buffer. That's not very much at all. That's less than a football field. And if I can throw to a quarterback and get to some industrial area, that's not much protection in my opinion at all. Also, as they clear this land, if they elect to burn some of the debris, that's a serious health hazard to a lot of the residents in the neighborhood. I know a lot of people personally that have COPD, and they would probably get put in the hospital if they have to smell the smoke that's from having this land cleared off. There's also a serious concern about the floodplains, and as we know, those have gotten closer and closer. I have watched neighborhood, in the back of the neighborhood, multiple homes be completely destroyed from these flood zones. And further amending the land and changing things is going to cause that to be a worse problem. When you have less trees, they absorb less water, there's more erosion to the land, and those entire floodplains change. Even if the land is currently conservation, doesn't change at all. Finally, the safety issues is another thing. I mean, right now it sounds like there's not a solid plan to have any retail or industrial stuff on the east side of the railroad track. But if we rezone this, there is that potential in the future. I know it's not meant to tie into the neighborhood, and that's one of the recommendations with this, but there's still going to be an additional traffic flow, and it's going to bring more people there where there currently isn't any flow of people. Finally, I would like to say also that there's another issue going on Briarberry, land that directly ties into this land owned by Mr. David Motley, and they've recently clear cut all that land, so we've completely lost the sound barrier. From North Lowndes Road, I can stand on the street now and see smoke and pig. And I don't know if you guys have seen that area, but it really is something to see if you go down there. It's really sad. I grew up in that area, and it brings tears to my eyes to see that. There's a lot of people very emotional about that. I hope to have covered a lot of the concerns. There certainly is a lot to elaborate on. Happy to try to answer any questions you guys have, and I'm sure we've had a good turnout because of how upset everybody is, and I'm sure some other people have some added value to bring as well.
Thanks. Any questions? Is there anyone else who would like to speak out against this project?
Gretchen, Quarterman, 6565 Quarterman Road. I don't know that I'm necessarily speaking against, because people have the right to do with their property what they want. I have concerns, though, My property is immediately across from Langdale Park. Langdale Park is a chronically flooded area in our community. So I'm concerned with the flood map. I'm concerned with how water flows off of this property into the river. The river is one of our greatest resources, and protecting it is very important. So I just want to make sure that, you know, whatever happens here, and I get definitely that the railroad is an impediment, but and dealing with CSX to get crossing is almost impossible, but that doesn't mean it is impossible. And so if it does become developed on the east side across the railroad, that water would not get bad in the river. Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like?
Hello, my name is Gina Strickland. I also live on Bradbury. We kind of had it brought to our attention that it looks like when you look on some of the public area that some of that land is for sale that Mr. Langdale was talking about as well. So would we have a guarantee if somebody buys that land and it's rezoned for that reason, are they going to stick with the things that they said has to be done that way? I too am in agreement that amount, less than a football field, it's not that far to go in the backyards of our children and the flood zones. I guess you guys remember how we flooded halfway up the houses on the back street there. And I know that I just watched a house be built in a neighborhood in Grove Point, where the house that was being built, there was already a problem with the water. Now there's like a river running between two houses in Grove Point. And that was just two houses being built. So I can't imagine disturbing all that land and pushing it back. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Wendy Scott. I live at 4629 Briar Drive in Foxborough.
I'm sorry, what was your first name?
Wendy Scott. So again, you see pretty much the majority that's sitting in here are baseline out of this community. On top of that, something that's not been addressed that we're seeing a lot more of, we have a whole apartment complex that's going up across the street from us. So our traffic flow is already horrendous on that highway. And if this opens up to more of that kind of traffic, we have a lot of accidents between even our subdivision next to where the cemetery is at and coming out of McDonald's. So this is going to increase the traffic population, and we haven't even opened those apartments that are fixing to open across the street. I don't know how many are in there. But with the change of the land mass going in, because we don't know what that's fixing to be at the front of our subdivision area, and the change of this, my concern is how we're going to deal with the traffic issues on top of the flooding issues and the other issues that we've already brought up. I don't know if that's even been looked at as a map because they're widening Valdell on top of this. So that's fixing to open up our whole area in there for a lot more traffic, pretty much like what we're doing on exit 18. And so the concern is going to be is what is that going to look like for support systems when it comes to all the accidents and the issues that we're having for that as well, on top of the stuff that's already been addressed tonight. Thank you.
Got time for one more.
Good evening. My name is Don Dropowitz. I'm at 4629 West Ridge Road. We've been there 27 years, and you can go see through the woods pretty good back that way. My concern is I work for a trucking company. I used to work at Railway down at Lake Park for 17 years. Now I work for SS Express Lines in Albany. And when I was down there, it was in 78. I went in 80. They already had a hazardous material spill of poison. It killed half that field out there towards the pond. My concern would be having something like that that's there that in this shows about having terminals and those kind of things. Can be noise, brings in a lot of different things. And I'd be worried about the hazardous material that those warehouses or whatever may have in those locations. And if it drifts our way, it could be hazardous to us. The other thing I was thinking about is that we've had a lot of crime that comes had, people breaking in like at 3 o'clock in the morning. I've got some video that I turned into the police, where they go check car doors and stuff to find if they can find guns and those kind of things. They found some of those people. So that would be my concern. My recommendation would be to maybe not zone any differently on the east side. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. This time we'll close the public hearing. Do we have any more discussion from the board, questions?
I think most of it is maybe JD. First of all, we're talking about the burning. Presently, I think you can burn like it is right now. And if there's question about burn, even if it's not rezoned, they can go out there and clear it and burn everything that they want to out there, out of the wetland. Floodplain, they were talking about the floodplain, I think that's already been delineated, has it not?
I do not believe the floodplain exactly has been delineated. The maps we've seen tonight were the proposed 2021 FEMA maps that are consideration for adoption, but as far as an environmental wetland delineation by a surveyor or a licensed engineer, I do not believe that has been conducted at this point. It would be required moving forward if anything were to be developed on this property.
All right, and the runoff that they were talking about, has engineers looked at that, city? Basically no, because we don't know what's going there presently.
Correct. This is just a land use consideration. Any actual engineering work for stormwater runoff, one would be required to be retained on the property, accepted engineering methods, but no, it has not been evaluated at this point.
Same with traffic study.
There has not been specific traffic for this property in question. However, with all the recent development mentioned, the apartments in North Valdosta, the widening, yes, multiple traffic studies have been done in this area. There is a traffic light coming to the intersection of Camelot Crossing, which is there between Culver's and the gas station and Cross Point Church there. Again, due to the nature of development. So.
JD, I guess the required environmental study commission would address if need be, how this property butts up to what I can see as a conservation easement on the west side of the Constitution.
Yes, sir.
How many things took place on the property? I know there's a conservation easement based on what these maps say.
Correct. It's a conservation zoning line. Yes, sir.
Or it's almost, excuse me, the other way.
Yes, sir.
So that study would address anything that took place on the east side of this property and how that might affect.
Correct. It would have to be for the entire property. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And just for clarification, JD, all those Lowe's distribution centers that you showed, they're not, that don't mean anything, it just tells you what possibly the amount that go there, that does not depict what's going there.
Correct. That was just a reference for scale, something local. You could fit essentially like 10 Valdosta malls on the property, but that's the parking area thing.
Looking at that, JD, and the traffic, they decided to put warehouses down there, 41, got tractor trailers, so I mean, they got a big problem with our little road already. And then coming from the interstate there, and tractor trailers, you know, we need to try to widen 41.
That's where the condition number 2 comes in, that if they deem that road is unsuitable, and that would be up to the developer and the engineer at that time, they would put that cost on the developer to pay for those upgrades to the roadway.
JD, can you speak generally on chemicals were brought up? And as far as the difference between M1, M2, and M3, and where any kind of chemical processing would fall into that?
I can at a high level. M1 is our lowest category of manufacturing, and it's light manufacturing, mainly larger warehouses, things like that. M2 is when you get into things that require EPD plus approval, considerations of noise, smell, odor, vibrations. So if a user did come in, looking at this site, thought it was viable, and based on their proposed use, had some of those nuisance factors or dangerous chemicals, then it would likely be another rezoning consideration. And again, it would be a consideration to go for this board or go for the commissioners. That's based on that specific use. Right now, based on speculative use for warehousing or data center, as Mr. Langdale mentioned, and looking at the possibility of those type of uses, M1 was the most appropriate zoning for that at this time. The least intrusive to allow for the possible size that some of the potential end users could do, yes ma'am.
There was one other question that I want to get clarified, which I think I know the answer for, but I'm going to say, can he sell it? Yes, he can sell it. Would the zoning stay the same? And yes, it will stay the same. It would have to be rezoned differently than what is approved here tonight and the commissioners approved at their meeting.
Correct, so zoning conditions run with the land regardless of the owner. Any request to change those conditions has to go before this board and the Board of Commissioners.
But if somebody wanted to come in and some of the hazardous stuff that you talked about, like M2 and 3, it'd have to be rezoned again. It's not automatically done.
Correct.
So there should not be a lot of noise factor with M1 zoning. It would fall in M2, correct?
Correct, and again, that's why, that's the intent of the buffers there.
Okay.
And again, I'll restate, the minimum buffer for M1 zoning next to residential is only 40 feet.
Okay. I just want to be sure we're protecting the adjoining.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I think I have everything I said.
There's nothing further, we'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, case set before us this evening, county case REZ-2025-11, the Langdale Capital Investment. Current zoning is combination of CC, R1, and some conservation district. I make a motion that we approve the zoning to M1 light manufacturing and conservative district.
Would you like to include the conditions?
Yes, sir, and also the 7 conditions that the county has stated. I second that, Mr. Chairman.
Second by Chairman, or Hightower. All in favor? 4. All opposed? 4 to 3. Thank you, thank you. All right, that concludes our caseload tonight.